Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of
the Super Data Brothers Super Show.
That's right. I am Ryan.
And I am Eric.
And we are two real life brothers who work in the data and analytics industry. And have we got a good one for you today, folks?
Boy, do we. You know, Ryan, I'm so excited for today's show because we're talking to Laura Madsen. So the topic of, CDO, all data stuff. And this is the first time I've heard this term, so I'll be interested to learn about it. Fractional CDO. Right. So Laura Madsen is a fractional CDO, among other things she does, and she works for Moxy Analytics. So, we'll be talking about all things data. We'll be talking about being a CDO, how to become a CDO, how to stay a CDO, and all that sort of thing. So I think it should be a very interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're really excited to have her on. And we've been trying to book her for a while, actually. It's mostly on me that it took us so long to get her on the show. But finally we have, and I'm very thrilled to be talking with her. Of course, this is a live show, folks. And what that means is that it's more fun for us and it's more fun for you if you get your live reactions, questions, comments, concerns into the chat. So whether you're watching on YouTube or watching on LinkedIn, let us know what you think about the conversation. Get your questions in there. We will read them live to Laura and we'll get her take on all the hot topics of the day. And so before we bring her on, we do want to talk real briefly about where you can meet the Super Data Brothers coming up here in just a few weeks. You can see I attended Data Council last week down in Austin, Texas. I'm back, and in 2 weeks, one-day event here in the Detroit area, April 18th, the Great Lakes Analytics Conference and AI. Everything's got to be AI now, right? So it's Analytics and AI Conference coming up. Is that not on here? Oh, come on, man. I edited the slide, but apparently the changes didn't come in. So on April 18th, not featured here, you will be able to meet us at the Great Lakes Analytics Conference. Very excited for that. Very cool one-day event. Eric and I will both be there, and Good Data is also a sponsor. So you'll be able to meet both of us, check out all sorts of cool stuff at the event. And then the Gartner Data and Analytics Summit, May 13th through 15th in London. I will be there as part of our Good Data sponsorship of the event. So feel free to swing by the Good Data booth, say hello. Happy to talk data all day with you at either of those events. And we'll have more coming up. I think we'll probably be at both Snowflake and Databricks in June, Big Data London in the fall, and also DBT Coalesce again as I was last year. But those are not for sure yet. So lots of opportunities to meet in person. I will be bringing some of the coveted Super Data Brothers t-shirt with me. And so if you run into me at one of those shows, be sure to ask for one. And if there are any left, I will let you have one. Okay. Anything else we need to cover before we bring Laura on the show today?
No, I think that about covers it. As always, if you want to give a shout out where you're tuning in from, we'll give you if you want to leave a comment of where you're tuning in from, we'll give you a shout out. And as we go, if you have any questions, even if they're newbie questions or critical questions or pro questions, any questions or comments, leave them in and we'll bring them up and talk about them.
All right. Awesome. And with that said, let's go ahead and bring Laura, to the Super Data Brothers show. Laura.
Welcome.
Laura, welcome to the show.
Hi. Hello. Happy to be here. I've been called worse.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you for bearing with me while we tried to schedule this over the last 6 weeks or so. It's great to finally have you here. And I think a very topical conversation. If I look at what it seems like is going on in the industry. There's of course always people who want to move up into data leadership, but maybe the face and the role of data leadership is ever changing. And so we're really happy to have you on today to just get your take on that and your experience there. So let's just start with, who is Laura Madsen? What is a fractional CDO, and what was your journey to this role?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see here. Who is Laura Madsen? Well, I started in data and analytics 25 years ago. So I was in it when many people weren't.
Yeah.
And really came to it sort of accidentally. I have a master's degree in something called applied psychology, which is actually a degree program that uses statistical methods to control for error in like real life data, hence the applied part. It's often attributed to social sciences like survey data or unstructured data, a lot of qualitative assessment, things like that. My first professional job, I had to work with a software company where all that data was entered. And then once we got the data in there, I couldn't actually use it because it didn't land in a shared repository. And that started my career in data and analytics, traditional data warehouses, like we all sort of have lived with for many decades at this point. And then I've just kind of done just about everything you can imagine. The first good chunk of my career is banging against the data. I am a card-carrying introvert. And so there's nothing I love more than sitting in my cube with my headphones on and just like, banging against the data until it cried for mercy. But at one point or another, the thing that sort of differentiated me was I was very good at explaining what was happening in the data and what insights could be culled from that to people that didn't get it. So mainly executives. And that started my leadership and management career in data and analytics. And so I've done a little bit of everything in the space. I mean, you can imagine 25 years, a long time. And so today I am with Moxy Analytics. I co-founded it with my business partner, Serena Roberts. And my official title with Moxy is Chief Blow Shit Up Officer. And really what that's about is there's a lot of long-held conventions about how we exist in the data space and the data industry that I think just don't serve us very well anymore. So a lot of how I exist in the space is just pushing the envelope, poking the bear, if you will. And I wrote a book called Disrupting Data Governance. It came out at the end of 2019. And that really pushed me off into the whole disruption and, which I already had done a lot of. And so one of the things I needed to figure out, of course, is how do I show up to my, to potential customers, if you will. And I made up the term fractional CDO.
Yeah. It sounds like something fractional CDO. It sounds like something a crypto bro would try to sell me. Bro, you need to get in fractional CDOs. NFTs are gone. All right.
That's right.
Yeah, it's all about fractional CDO now.
Non-fungible CDO. That's
Yep, exactly. So so at the time there were a whole bunch of like fractional roles that existed out in the world, and I was like, well, honestly, most companies I know could use a fractional version of a CDO, right? There's a lot of companies in the world that don't need a full-fledged one. So I threw my moniker out there, right? I've been a data leader for a really long time, and I just, for the most part, what I didn't want to do as a consultant was end up being a default or defunct employee, right? A lot of consultants end up at a company for 2, 3, 4 years, essentially being an employee. And so the fractional part was really important to me. So a lot of what I do for organizations is they lost a CDO and they need somebody in the middle of that for a while. So filling that gap. They've never had one and they want to know if it makes sense for them. Or my personal favorite, they hired a new one and the job is giant and the person needs a trusted lieutenant. So those are kind of how I exist in that space.
Let's talk about, the CDO in general. What are CDOs doing in 2024? Like if someone has that title, what are their responsibilities? What are the primary concerns that you see out there in the data world today?
Yeah, well, it can be summed up in 2 letters.
Yeah, right. But can I guess them?
Yeah.
Is it AI?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and another way to say that is BS, but that's a different conversation.
Yes. We can
Yeah,
have that conversation.
yeah. I mean, there's just been a lot of pressure out there. If you still have a job as a CDO, which of course we all know that the tenure of CDOs is pretty low. I think, a couple of years ago it was like 3 to 5. Now it's much closer to that 3-year mark. 18 months isn't terribly uncommon. And a lot of that is because we don't really know what we're supposed to be asking CDOs to do. So enterprises as a whole, like if you read a lot of these job descriptions, they're 2 pages long, and you're asking a CDO to do everything from interacting to your board to running SQL queries. And I've literally seen those job descriptions. So we lack clarity, which it always makes it really problematic. And then, of course, AI came in there, and it's just like, well, your CDO has to build an AI strategy, which is insanely, yeah. How do you build an AI strategy?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think 2024 represents that. I mean, the end of 23 wasn't great for that either, but that is a lot of what the focus has been lately.
And do you find like, so what you mentioned, like you've seen job postings where it's yes, talk to the board, but also actually run the SQL queries. What do you think is driving that? I mean, is there just like a misunderstanding or not enough clarity around the value of the role and why you would have it? Was it a fashionable thing? Like a lot of companies said, oh, we need a CDO without actually asking why.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was probably a little bit of that. We do struggle with being super precise about the value of data to our organizations. And so therefore, it ended up being this sort of amorphous like CDO role. There's no standard, there's no industry standard of what that means. So every enterprise can come up with their own. And often what that ended up meaning was everything from a super technical sort of back end, run a data warehouse, know what data engineering is, data modeling, data architecture, all the way to having, very savvy front end considerations for how to interact with stakeholders. And most people don't interact on both sides of that continuum. Even within our own industry, those of us that are really embedded on the data management side, what you'd consider to be more of the back end, architecture, modeling, engineering, even in some respects data governance, don't interact nearly as often with the front end parts of the world, right? The data visualization, the data consumers, all the UX designers, right? We don't have a lot of conferences that totally bridge the gap between those two things. So I think it's just the data function as a whole. I like to compare to an ecosystem, like ones we've all learned about in like the 4th grade. And there are no natural boundaries in an ecosystem. And so therefore there are no natural boundaries in our organization to put data in a little box and say, this is exactly the boundary in which you exist. And I think that's kind of where we ended up with not only the job descriptions, but just this whole conversation about where does data sit in an organization? Who does it report to? How do we know we're being successful with it? What are the limitations to investment? All of those things are a byproduct of the fact that data exists throughout the organization. It's completely ubiquitous, and lots of us do something with it, which makes an executive level role exceedingly difficult.
So how do you personally approach that challenge then? I mean, how are you defining the boundaries of the role in your engagements?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. So first and foremost, like for folks that are listening, right, it is way easier to be a fractional CDO and come in as a consultant than it is to sit in that seat and live in it all the time. I have been a data leader and I've been in that seat, so I know the pressures that exist. So that support function is really important, which is why I like that idea of being that trusted lieutenant, if you will. But for me, the biggest thing is how clear can I get those boundaries? How clearly can we define what success looks like for that CDO role, even if it's just me for a period of time? As a consultant, one of the things or an advisor, everybody hates that word, the consultant. I don't really care what you call me. I don't care what you, this is a joke I use all the time. I don't care what you call me, but I answer to Laura. But I think that being a consultant, one of the benefits of that, right, is that I have to get really clear about the paperwork. I have to, like a lawyer has to read that and say, yeah, I know when Laura Madsen's going to be done with us, right? And the trouble with being an employee is you don't have that. Like, there's not a definitive, like, at the end of June, Laura's wrapping up. How do we know she's going to be successful? You know, at the end of June, Ryan's wrapping up. I don't, maybe he's, you know what I mean? Like, we don't do that as an employee. So we lack those very specific sort of stage gates of how we know we're successful. So that's one of the benefits, is that we sit down and we have a very thorough conversation about what that looks like. How do you know that you're getting the value out of my time, to make sure that you can either answer, do we need a CDO, or does my CDO continue to need support, or are we good to go?
Gotcha. Yeah. So you really have the advantage of kind of the essentially, you know, the consulting contract, or SOW, that is outlining your specific objectives.
Yep. Yeah. And one could argue everybody should have something like that. You know, we all start jobs like that with a 30, 60, 90 day, right? Like, how do I know I'm being successful in the first 30 days? Well, what's stopping us from doing that, you know, post that 90-day mark? Even if you don't share it, just so you know that you're being successful, so that if somebody starts knocking on your door wondering what you're doing, or why they're paying you that salary, right? You're ready for that conversation.
Yeah. I have a huge Google Doc called What Must Be Done, that is just this running list of like what initiatives I'm trying to push forward, and then I'm lining them out, you know, as they get over the finish line, so that I just can keep track of it myself, but also for this exact reason. So I can turn around and say, well, you know, look at the lined out stuff. Remember when we did this? Remember when we did that? Like, that was, you know, part of our success plan at the time. So how is the overall, I definitely want to get into how AI equals BS, but you know, let's explore the CDO role a little bit more before we get into that.
Yeah.
What is the overall path to becoming one? A lot of people, like I saw, you know, Joe Reese and Sol Rashidi, I think, are doing a course now on how to become a data leader, right? And what that path looks like. A lot of people are interested in this path. You know, it's not easy, but eventually in technical roles, you may cap out. You're the senior engineer, you know, you're a principal architect. If you want to continue to advance, you're going to have to get into leadership.
Yeah.
What does that path look like, and how does it eventually lead to CDO? What are the steps to get there?
Yeah. Well, so again, our industry lacks specifications, right? We don't have a lot of standards for what that looks like. Like, you know, you get
which is ironic, because we're like a part of IT, which is all they care about sometimes.
Is requirements.
Yep. Well, and it's ironic too, considering what we're supposed to be doing for a living. We're supposed to be metrics-driven individuals. Yet a lot of data and analytics teams that I work in don't have what I would consider to be basic metrics to run your department as like a full-fledged department, right? Yeah, that should be a thing. So what does it take to become a CDO? Like, if you talk to CDOs, they will tell you that there are an enormous amount of variety in terms of how they got there. I happen to have a very sort of statistically focused background, and then I ended up in, you know, data and analytics for a really long time. But a lot of the CDOs that I talk to don't have that, right? And there's a varying degree of backgrounds. And some of that is because the universities didn't catch up with us for a really long time, right? There weren't data specific bachelor's degrees or master's degrees or anything like that, right? It was just sort of like computer science. So what I've seen a lot of is, you know, if you have your CDOs that are more on the business side, more like a chief data analytics officer, they tend to have more of a business background, and they've grown up through the business. Maybe they were an analyst and they ended up being a CDO that way. If you see the CDOs that are much more on the technical side, which tends to be the majority, those folks generally have some kind of computer science background, like a bachelor's degree in computer science or more, and have grown up through like the data warehouse side of the business. But this is the challenge because, like I said, not all CDOs are created equal, even in their own enterprises. So you could have had a CDO title somewhere and not be qualified to be a CDO somewhere else because of the way that they think about that. So.
Gotcha. But so you would say that they do tend to more rise up through the technical versus kind of the data analyst side of things, though. Why do you think that is?
Probably because so this is, rather than the data industry, this is the organizations and enterprises now. Organizations and enterprises still more often attribute data to a technical function. We still have not gotten really good at assigning value to data as information that drives insights in our organizations. And, I consider myself sort of one of these people where it's like, believe it or not, even though it's kind of my job, I'm not always great about talking about data because I am a data person. So if an executive comes to me and tries, asks me a question like, how come this report isn't working? Right? My answer usually makes him have his eyes roll into the back of his head. So as a result, right, all the business people here, all those business executives here, is technology hard, somebody else's job.
Yeah.
Right. And it takes a long time to kind of get out of that line of thinking, if you will, and put yourself in more of that executive level type of communication, because executives talk differently than like individual contributors at the front line by design, right? They have to. So I think a lot of that is, regardless to whether or not you're coming up the technical side or the business side, communication is an incredibly important thing. You're not going to get to that level if you don't know how to communicate to that audience.
Yeah, there's been a real, I think there's been a recognition. This comes in waves over the course of my career. I think we had one of the waves recently, a recognition of the importance of what they like to call soft skills for data people. And I always say, for data people, the soft skills are the hard part, right?
Sure.
How would you recommend? How can somebody go about beginning to improve in that area? Like what, you have a statistical background, right? How did you learn to communicate like an executive?
That's a great question. Some of it was time. Like when I was young, in my early 20s, I had, I still kind of am like this. Who am I kidding? I tend to be a little bit too abrupt and to the point. And, somebody asks me a question, I answer it directly. And then it's like, but there's no context there and blah. So I think a lot of it is just practice, right? It's like practice with people that have, think at a higher, more strategic level. And they don't always have to be executives. Like you probably have somebody in your life that thinks at that level, that thinks like
For
that.
Ryan, it's his brother.
Oh, okay.
True story.
Yeah, and then practice with that person until you get to the point where you're able to have those conversations in a meaningful way. It's that whole thing about elevator pitches. I think, I have gotten to the point now where it's like in every situation where I'm in that CDO role, one of the first things I do is I create an elevator pitch. So if somebody's like, so who are you and why are you here? I can answer that, and it answers at a level that 98% of the people that ask me, could understand it. It's not me saying, a bunch of obscure acronyms and, trust me, I know what I'm talking about kind of stuff. It really is just about crafting the messages and striking the right balance so that organizations can understand how you can support them from a data and analytics perspective.
So the word YAML should never appear in your elevator pitch.
Nor should gigaflops.
Excellent. So now we've kind of talked about a little bit about getting the CDO, the technical path versus the analyst path. The technical path is maybe a little more common, but the importance of communication as the CDO, a big part of your job, I think, is communicating what's happening with the data to the other executives in a way that they understand, that matters for them. What are the ways, you mentioned earlier, like the struggle to value data beyond, the technical side, the amount, number of pipelines and the amount of data that's processed. And, us data geeks care about that.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of our world, nobody cares. How can you identify, value and best communicate it? Like, what is that value to non-data departments?
Yes. Well, so this one will likely terrify people.
Good.
Yeah. You and I can't pick the value. And that's where, being out there and talking and understanding what is driving the need is critically important. Because the only way you can actually assign value to any data is by the consumers. And they get to pick what value means for them. And so we often get lost in that hell, like, well, I gotta communicate, I gotta show my value. So like, how do I do that, right? And so Laura, assigning value to something when I don't really understand the operational aspects of the business and what they're trying to drive for, what pressures they have every day, day in and day out. So value is assigned by your consumers. And once you know those things, then that's the language that you use.
I once heard someone, and I apologize to whoever said this. I can't remember where it came from, but I once heard this short quote, which was, "Data is a service industry." I'm curious if you agree with that statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably make that claim. A lot of when I'm helping organizations reorg or restructure their teams, one of the analogies I use all the time is restaurants. Because most of us have worked in a restaurant at some point in college. So that's front of the house, back of the house, right? And so, that is a construct around the service industry. I think the challenge that data has, and this is why we're still talking about this in 2024, is it is not something so easily put into a little box. Like, yeah, there is absolutely a big part of this that has to be driven by service. But there is also a pretty big part of this that ends up being deeply technical. Yeah, I think the value can only be derived by consumers using data. So therefore, if we're going to have to pick which one of those things wins, it's probably that service aspect of it. But you can't serve data up for the masses if, your data repositories aren't performative, if the visualizations, can't operate, can't respond, don't make sense. All of those things are real, technical things that we have to live through. So that is one of the reasons why I think data defies definition.
Yeah, gotcha. It's interesting because we've had other guests come on before and bring up the restaurant analogy or something similar. I don't remember it's come up multiple times. I don't remember who first introduced it to the topic, but like the franchise model in analytics, right? Where it's like
that.
The big franchise model. Yeah, where it's just like you build, because like the assumption is, and you talked about this, Laura, a bit, like it needs to be working, but if you build it, you can't just build it because they won't come. If you build it, they will come is not true. So like it's the balance of like, it needs to actually work and be good. And two, you need to let people know it works and is good and make sure they actually like it and use it. So like, that's something we've talked about a lot. So it's definitely an interesting topic.
It has to actually be valuable to them, to Laura's point. Like, I've told the story many times on the show, but many, like 15 years ago now, I once built an OLAP cube that was the most beautiful OLAP cube you could have ever designed in 2010, and nobody cared, right? Because it didn't do what they needed.
Right. Yeah. And we all have stories like that, right? And the build it and they will come kind of thing, like for one thing, who would ever thought that we'd still be dealing with a Kevin Costner movie from the 90s? But I still work with a lot of organizations that think that, Like, hey, they keep asking for data, I'm just going to create something for them, right? And there's this hubris that comes with that in many respects. Like, it's sort of like Steve Jobs saying, well, I'm not going to ask them what they want. They don't even know what they want, right? It's like, sure, okay, but that's your fault, not theirs. Right? Like,
Yeah.
we are not Steve Jobs. And if we are, we probably wouldn't have the title of principal data architect in, Jim Bob's body shop. So, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of work there.
Apple gets referenced so constantly for this exact reason. And it's like, it's the one example everyone can think of where they had the vision to build a bunch of stuff and it worked,
Yeah.
but it so frequently doesn't. When you have that attitude of, well, I know what they need,
right,
and they don't,
right, right.
It's very dangerous to assume that you're the next Steve Jobs.
Yes. Oh man, the jokes that are going through my head right now. Some of them are deeply inappropriate, but yeah, the reality is, like, he's an N of one, and we're data people, and we should not be thinking about the ends of one, right?
Yeah.
But the other part of it was he was right? He was creating something that didn't exist. We are all living within the confines of the thing that's been around for 5 decades now, right? With preconceived notions, some of them wrong, limitations that are real or not. Those are all things that we're living within. It's not like greenfield stuff, which is where he was existing, So, and he also built products. And I know we love to talk about data as products, but like it's like this. I'm talking about like a tangible piece of a thing that didn't exist. It is not apples to apples by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even probably two fruits. It's probably like apples and broccoli or something. I don't even know, but not necessarily helpful for us.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good time to then think about, you mentioned the data industry is not new. And we talked to a lot of guests on this show who kind of came into the data industry with the modern data stack, right? To them, the first tooling they ever worked with was Snowflake and DBT, and maybe like an old tool to them would be Tableau, right? Yeah, that's how I feel too.
Making me feel bad. Making me feel bad about myself.
No, it's good. It's one of the reasons why we're excited to have you on is to ask questions like, you have a lot of experience. What would you say the most wrong or what are the most dangerous ideas in the data industry right now?
Oh boy. Gosh, that's a doozy of a question. It's a really good question. Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind is, I think with AI, like sort of darkening our doorsteps, the intention to double down and put data back even more robustly back into IT. Like, we've made inroads in data and analytics to be pushed out to the business, right? We've been making some inroads, but now AI hovering there, everybody thinks AI technical, really, really hard, back to IT. I think that is probably one of the most dangerous assumptions for our industry. And I've been recently quoted as saying, like, the next by the quoted, I mean, mainly in my head, that the data industry is going to be a dumpster fire for the next 3 to 5 years for this reason, because we are going to be running around like crazy people trying to figure out where we fit, what makes sense, how do we, define our value, how do we stay out from under the moniker of IT. So, I think if we're to really critically think about that, that's probably one of the most dangerous things. And we've sort of seen this over the years, right? Where it's like, when data first started, it was very, very, very much an IT function. When I first started going to conferences, nobody ever talked about people. They never talked about process. They never talked about cultural enablement. We sure as hell didn't talk about whatever you want to call data literacy now, which, everybody kind of hates that term, but the whole idea that people can consume information and gain insights from it. We didn't have that concept. We did not worry about people. Build it and they will come was like something we were super proud of identifying with. Like, you're right, we're going to build it. We're so smart. So, we've seen other versions of this in the past. And I think that we could very well see a much more extreme version of it as we head into whatever the future looks like with AI. And I think just in general, any assumption that technology is going to solve our problems has always been a dangerous thing for us as a data industry, and the things that we end up doing as a result of that. No tool can solve poorly defined problems.
Yeah, man, that is true.
Yeah.
What do you see that? Do you think there's emerging pressure to push data back under IT and re-technicalize it, for lack of a better word?
Yeah. I mean, I'm seeing some whispers of it. Seen LinkedIn articles about that kind of recently, where we're starting to see that early phases of that shift happening. It's interesting that within the last maybe 3 years, there's been a steady decrease of the title of CIO. So as organizations were sort of almost decentralizing or kind of creating a federated concept around even software consumption. So any tool you buy now has some kind of dashboard in it. And now every tool that you buy is going to have an AI point solution in it. And so if I'm a CFO, why do I need a CIO to do that when I can just go buy it and it lives within the confines of my department? So we were already starting to see a lot of that shift. But I think now starting to see the commercialization of AI, and that how expensive those point solutions could be with each of those departments, I absolutely could see a scenario where we get really excited about the idea of creating that sort of centralized function under IT that guides and sort of defines all of those things. Which again, I think is pretty dangerous proposition. And I just have always felt like the conversation around centralized and decentralized concepts for organizations, data and analytics organizations in particular, is a false narrative. It has to be both. Not going to be successful otherwise.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. That's very interesting. I think that this is a perpetual argument in our industry. And we've seen waves and waves of it, across different technologies, like the original wave of the data warehouses, data lakes, lake houses, who should own them and why, and how involved should the business be? What do you think of now you said it really needs to be both. What do you think of approaches that have taken off in the last, or at least gotten a lot of what do you think of these approaches that have gotten a lot of attention in the last few years, like data mesh and data fabric? Do you see those concepts catching on in the enterprise?
Yeah, sort of. I get a lot of questions about them. I think at a very high level, they make such intuitive sense. It is the question about how you actually operationalize that stumps all of us. What does that actually look like? How do we work together? And so it begs the question of how do you make sure that if you're going to do this, whether it's data mesh or the next version of that, how do you actually talk about it in a way that lets people know what they're supposed to be doing on an average Tuesday, right? And this is one of those things that I think about all the time, because one of the things I do is I write books, like, not shameless plug, but it's part of my job is I look at what's happening, I decompress a bunch of items, and then I write a book about it. And it's really easy to pontificate, even in a 175-page book, but it doesn't tell you what you're supposed to be doing on an average Tuesday. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. So theories are wonderful, but the questions I get around all of these technologies is like, but how does that actually work? And how does it work in a fully centralized or decentralized or whatever version of that you have? And And so I think there's a lot to be said for don't break, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of a thing, right? If we know that hybrid models work, I don't care what tool you have, frankly. I don't care what architecture you have. I don't care what, like who does what when. If it works, leave it alone. If it stops working, then you start to ask yourself really difficult questions. And you have to be super self-aware of your function and your capability, and you have to be really in touch with your business line to know, like all of a sudden you start to feel that shift, like things aren't working. You're getting more complaints instead of compliments, kind of a thing. But we are so, like as humanity, we're so good at chasing the next exciting thing. Like our brains love novelty, that we very rarely just sort of like, oh, well, this is working. Let's just sit with it for a minute and see how that goes. So I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said for that, especially right now. Like if you have aspects of your function that are working and you're being asked about AI, like let those things work while you try to figure that out, because there's a lot of work ahead of us.
Do you think when someone becomes a new leader that there's pressure to drive change just for change's sake?
Sure. Yeah, we've all been there, right? Yeah, and provide like big bang moments. And I think that is often why the tenure of CDOs is so short. There is no big bang. There's no low-hanging fruit for us anymore. Most of us have been doing this long enough to know what it takes, and the work takes what the work takes. Everybody's heard that it doesn't take 9 women 1 month to make a baby. So yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure, and as a result, it's like you're chasing after that new thing, that novelty thing. And if you look back historically, a lot of the stuff that we talk about today is the same stuff we talked about 25 years ago, is just under a new name, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about semantic layers back in the late 90s.
Right.
You just had no ability to do the thing that a semantic layer actually needed to do. And now we're living in the reality of what a semantic layer can do in the context of AI. So it's all the same stuff. We're just renaming it over and over and over again.
Like I saw a clip of Simpsons. Like who was the smart kid, like the nerd, like
Fun fact: I've watched like 2 episodes.
Yeah. Anyway, but like it's just like they were taking a job quiz, and they're like a job quiz, like, all right, systems analyst. Yeah, systems analyst. Is like systems analyst. Like no one uses that term anymore. The person probably calls himself a data engineer.
Yep.
Right.
Same thing though. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will sometimes when I'm talking to people, I'll say, I remember when we had this title called ETL developer.
Yeah.
And it was maybe a different tool set. There were some differences, but at the end of the day, it was still like building and maintaining the pipes, right?
Right.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, in that vein, like, what are there any particular technologies or approaches? I would say approaches, probably not technologies, but are there any particular approaches that we used to use in the data industry that have gone out of fashion that you think are still valuable and maybe we should bring back?
I mean, I think things that have gone out of fashion have gone out of fashion for a reason. They just couldn't kind of keep up with what was actually happening. The one that I do think would be really interesting is that many years ago there was a tool. Boy, I wish I could remember what it was called. But it essentially took words and which makes me laugh now considering the helm of ChatGPT, but and created a report, and then it would include some of your graphics, right? Gosh, I wish I would remember what it was called. I think something like that is probably going to be a reality very soon in terms of LLMs. So you could ask it a real world question like, what are the sales in the West region? And it would literally come up with your graphics plus a little bit of supporting content. So I think that was something that existed in the early to mid 2000s that will probably come to fruition again.
Yeah, that's I mean, with LLMs for sure. Like it's easy to see how technically that is way easier to solve than it was 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So let's talk about LLMs, right? You said earlier on in the show, AI is BS, and That's obviously a provocative statement. Why do you say that? Why is AI BS right now in data?
Yeah. So I've been doing a bunch of research on this topic recently. So you probably heard my brain like literally like do context shifting. I just slammed on the brakes and then started reversing and then going a different way. Smoke coming out of my ears. So the reality is, right, is that AI is a very overused, poorly defined term, right? So that in and of itself is why I consider AI to be BS right now. And if you pick up a theme for me, it's very much around this, like our lack of ability to be precise and clear about what we're doing and what we're talking about and how we're going to solve problems is part and parcel to the challenges that we're having in our industry. And so all of a sudden we have, AI that is like that thing on steroids, right? It's like AI is going to do everything. It's going to solve everything. It's like AI. It's like last summer I traveled to Denver to visit my aunt and uncle with my father, who is 90, and they're in their 80s. And we sat down to dinner, and the three of them proceeded to, old-splain me what AI is.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Like everybody's talking about it. And sometimes what they talk about is true, but most of the time it's really not. So that's really what the whole dumpster fire in the next 3 to 5 years thing is about. It's that terror of, gosh, guys, we got to stop talking about it and start defining it and start being really precise about what we mean. But also we have got to figure out where AI sits, maybe air quotes, against what we've considered to be the bread and butter of the data industry for almost 50 years now, which is fully structured data. And however you want to think about your data repository, modern data stack, blah, 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 because I've lived through all of those iterations. I remember laughing out loud when I first heard the term data lake. We have to get really precise about what that means and where those things exist, because there are very few functions that exist technologically today that can fully bridge the gap between the LLMs that we're all living and breathing now, like generative AI, ChatGPTs of the world, and our structured data. Like AI is great at structured data, but it's really geared more towards the semi and the unstructured data, which is what most of the world's data is, that, right? It's semi and unstructured data, like 80% of the data that exists in the world, which is what AI is supposed to be great at. So if you think about this, if the data in our organizations is primarily structured and leaning towards those sort of like numerical answers, X% of, number of sales in the Western region, and all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, do an AI strategy that's primarily around semi and unstructured data, like we don't have the skills, we don't have the tools. Like that's the crashing of those two things together. So I think there's a lot of false promises, and a lot of, like, we all have a skill gap. We all have a big skill gap right now, and I think we've got to find a way to close that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I was at Data Council. I was talking to someone who has an LLM-driven BI tool, and they were just this is a vendor, right? It's a startup, and they were telling me how challenging it is to even test their tool.
Sure.
Because the LLMs are non-deterministic. So how do you write a test case? Like you can write the test cases, but it's like what constitutes a pass? Like there's, traditionally we're used to like, well, it's, I do X and I get Y 100% of the time. And that is a passed test. And he was like, he was honest. He was like, honestly, it's the biggest struggle is even designing. How do we know when our software is accurate enough and when it's good enough and when it's doing what we intend, one thing I'm very curious, you're talking about like structured versus unstructured data. I feel that there's a tendency in data to look at AI and then conclude that what AI needs to be successful is the thing that you are already doing. Every vendor seems to be doing this, right? Like, oh, you know, for AI to be successful, you need a data catalog. And it just so happens that we're a data catalog vendor, or you need a semantic layer. And that one I actually believe in, but you need a semantic layer. And it's like all the semantic layer vendors are saying, yeah, you can have a AI without a semantic layer, or, you know, data quality. Like you have to have well-structured quality data to do AI. Are there any claims out there related to AI that you think are particularly bullshit when it comes to the data world? Like that sort of thing? Oh, you have to have structured data might be an example, but, you know, are there any others that just strike you as, like, based on your research, this is BS and we don't need to do this?
Yeah, I mean, so anytime a vendor uses the word easy, there should be 10 lashings with a wet noodle. Like when I was a purchaser, when I would sit on the other side of the table, right, and the vendor would come to me and the vendor would say the word easy, I'd be like, whoa, I'm going to stop you right there. Right? Because if nothing else, it's a flat out lie, right? But also what it does is it lands a certain way with our business partners, right? It lands with them differently than it lands with us. So anybody that talks about like, oh, it's a point solution. Like, we're going to use the ChatGPT 4.0 model where that's our baseline, and then you're going to put your data on top of it, and you're going to fine tune that thing, and you know you're going to get a customized bot. It's a piece of cake, right? Super easy. Right? That's it. Yes, but it's not easy. The other thing that I think is really important is like most organizations, I would venture to guess maybe 97% of them are not going to quote unquote do AI. I made this like pithy post like a week or so ago on LinkedIn. It's like nobody's going to do AI. It's not like slapping on some sneakers. Most organizations are not in a position to be able to start from scratch, you know, creating machine learning algorithms, you know, unsupervised data, blah, 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 blah. Like most of us are in a position where the best we can consider is point solutions and try to cobble them together and then try to help our stakeholders navigate through a varying degree of user experiences, which is a challenge in and of itself, right? So anything that makes it sound like it's easy is probably my biggest one, but that's true across the board when it comes to technology. I think, yeah, there's a lot that in terms of AI that's just being over promised. And for me, that's probably the biggest thing. Like, it really sounds like, you know, like, oh, pretty soon everybody is going to be replaced.
Yeah.
You know, that's like likely not going to happen.
I see a lot of solutions out there too that are, you know, startups that are able to raise capital based on the fact that they're essentially just a wrapper for GPT-4.
Yeah.
And then I imagine that they think their competitive advantage is that they have the best prompt engineers. But I mean, do you think, is this like a tenable business model? Are there going to be companies that's what they like? We just had the best GPT-4 wrapper. How is this going to shake out?
Yeah. I mean, no. I mean, I don't think it's a long. That's going to probably wash itself out pretty quickly. Because some of that stuff is relatively simple, and then the stuff that's not, those true fine tuning of the models where you're changing the behavior of them is a lot more complex. But if you're just literally like, so for example, Moxy worked with a company and we created a customized chat bot that we lovingly refer to as the Laura bot. The Laura bot right now was trained on all the content that I've written in the last, you know, probably 15 years. So that's awesome. three books, many blog articles, all those other things, right? So this Laura bot we're in testing, right? One of the things I used it for was to create a data governance leader job description. So I went out to just ChatGPT free version because that's what most people can use easily, and I asked it to write a job description for a data governance leader, and that was terrible job description. Right? In all honesty, it was not great. And then I used the Laura bot and I asked it exactly the same question, and it was a job description that I would have used right then. It was exactly what I needed it to be. So I think that, you know, those are things that can be done and are being done by lots of vendors right now. But that is a lot less complicated than, you know, going out and building whatever new thing, you know, that the do AI thing, right, that we keep hearing about. And that's that lack of specificity and clarity about what we're talking about.
Do you have any thoughts on the major AI models and vendors and you know, their relative capabilities, which ones you think are good, or, you know, now, or what you see happening with them in the future?
I mean, I don't right now because it's such a mucky everybody's in that space. There's a whole bunch of activity that's happening around that commercialization of AI. My biggest worry, honestly, right now is our organization's lack of governance, like our legitimate inability to govern responsibly technology as a whole, but particularly AI, where the speed and scale of screwing things up is like mind-boggling, right? And that's probably more true for the you know, the big tech companies that we all love to hate, right? So that's a big one for me. And the rush to the money thing is making us all not think clearly through that stuff. So I'm waiting a little bit right now before I get too wrapped up in who's doing what, like legitimately who's doing what, which is silly probably because because somebody better figure that out. But I'm waiting to hear what, you know, like there's been a lot of stuff that's coming out of Europe around standards and requirements around responsible AI. And I think it was just last week or 2 weeks ago, they kind of came out with here's what you have to do. And this whole idea of transparency and explorability within these deep neural networks is something that, like if it were my money and I was writing the checks, that's where I would be putting the money, because that's not something that's going to be fly by night. We've got to figure that out.
Yeah, we got a comment from a friend of the show, Paul Mendelson here. AI is a force multiplier when it comes to governance issues.
Yes, it is. But, you know, it's also interesting to me when I think about, you know, talking to people, like governance is a bad word in most organizations. And we probably need it more now than ever. But when people hear AI, they think we have to go fast, right? We have to operate at the speed of business. And then somebody comes in and says, well, we have to govern this thing, right? And it's like, well, that's not going fast. That's not operating at the speed of business. And they seem so contrary to most organizations. And for a lot of organizations, they really are. But there are ways that you can do both, where you can create standards and guidelines and operate in a responsible way while trying to move as quickly as possible.
Yeah, let me ask you, do you think AI is this real, or is this going to be another metaverse in 2 years? We're going to be looking back on it like, what the hell was that?
I mean, if what's already happened to art is any indication, then yes, it is real. It is not another blockchain, you know, situation. No. That's my input on it, but
for sure. No, I think it's real. I think it's real. And yeah, the potential for it being an absolute shit show is really high right now.
There's such huge pressure, I think, on everybody to just do something, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's 2024 budget available to just do something.
Yes.
We don't know what.
I'm even like on the university level, I'm seeing that, like university tech departments. I work for university tech departments. There is some pressure from certain higher level people saying we need to do something.
Yep.
What that something is, can't tell you. But something needs to be done.
Yes, that's exactly it. We have to do something. We have to have an AI strategy. I don't even know what AI is. It sounds a lot like slapping on some tennis shoes, right? But again, it's this thing we keep repeating, which is, you know, when it's poorly defined, we're not going to do a good job at it. And so, you know, if you're in one of those positions where somebody's telling you just do something, the thing that you have to do is define what AI means to your organization as quickly as possible. Put some really tight boundaries in there so that you know when you're successful.
Do you think we're going to have a CAIO at any time in the near future?
You know, I was at a conference, the DMZ, Data Modeling Zone conference in Phoenix a couple weeks ago, and we had this conversation around the table, and somebody actually said, "Oh, I know one."
Well, no way.
Chief AI officer.
CA.
So
Yeah,
CAIO EIEIO.
Ciao. Yeah.
Yeah. Ciao.
Ciao.
In more ways than one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So we're at the top of the hour here. I want to thank you for joining us. This was just like a fascinating conversation, and really appreciate your insight into data and AI and the CDO role. And is this two questions to wrap up? Is this AI question the major question that you think CDOs will be tasked with solving in the upcoming years?
Yes.
And then final question, for someone entering the industry who's interested in entering the industry, whether it's a young person or someone doing a career transition, what advice do you have for making the most out of a career in data?
Oh boy. Well, I would tell them probably not to study a lot on traditional ways of creating data repositories or modern data stacks, because what we considered to be a modern data stack a year ago is, retro data stack now. So I would encourage them to really think a little bit differently about what that looks like for the future. And there's a lot of really legitimate, valuable content out in the world about AI and what that looks like and what that would mean for organizations. So I would encourage them to lean a little bit more into that than what would be considered more traditional tracks. Because again, if you can create some really tight boundaries and explain with some clarity and do an excellent job communicating when we talk about that data value chain all the way from acquisition and ingestion all the way out to that consumer layer, while sort of wrapping some AI concepts around that you will be golden.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Laura, for joining us today. It was really fun.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
There, I put a link to your LinkedIn on the post in case anyone wants to check you out.
Oh yeah, that's the obvious question. Where can people find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a good one. You can go to moxyanalytics.com and that's where we are on the internet. I'm not supposed to call it interweb. My younger younger people in my company have told me that. Bad habit. But yeah, moxyanalytics.com or the LinkedIn spot is good there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Laura.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, man, that was awesome.
Yeah.
All right, just as a reminder, folks, you can always catch us here most Thursdays at noon.
Most
noon
Thursdays.
Time. Most Thursdays. Coming up
on LinkedIn or on YouTube.
That's right. Yeah, if you watch us on LinkedIn, do hop over to YouTube, the Super Data Brothers channel. Give us a like, follow. Lots of content. The entire back catalog is there. So I have people ask me all the time, where can I see your old shows? They're all available for free on YouTube on demand.
All on YouTube.
All on the YouTube. Yeah, go check it out. And then also coming up April 18th here in Detroit City. Actually, it's in Troy. So in the suburbs of Detroit City, we will both be at the Great Lakes Analytics and AI Conference. It's a one-day conference. Very cool. You should come check it out, especially if you're in the region. Come say hello. We don't have enough of a data scene here in Detroit. There's lots of people doing innovative data work, but we're not getting together and having drinks and getting to know one another. So we gotta kick that up, folks, and do come to the conference and check it out. We will both be there. All right. Any last words for the people?
No, I think that about covers it. Oh, one thing. His name is Martin. I looked it up.
Thank you, His
Eric. Name is Martin.
I should have known that.
Future systems analyst, right there.
I've watched thousands of hours of The Simpsons over the course of my life, and the fact that
I couldn't think of that one. I'm like, no, it's not Ralph. It's not. Ralph's a dumb one.
Cool. All right.
All right.
Upcoming shows, by the way, next week we're going to have an interview with Lindsay Murphy from Sakota about data value and more particularly how to stop wasting money on your modern data stack. Will be next week. And then I believe the week after that, we're going to be doing, finally, I did an interview with Shamak Dagani, the creator of Data Mesh. I've been trying to line that up for over a year. We were both in Austin. managed to do that. So that's what we have coming on tap the next 2 weeks. So tune in, folks, for those.
All right.
And, until next week, I'm Ryan.
I am Eric.
And we are the Super Data Brothers. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.